an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Ruin and Rising, chapters 3 and 4. In these chapters, our friends begin their sojourn through the caves and underground systems, and then they get bombed? Maybe? Not entirely sure. Also, we've got a little bit of a Kylo Ren and Rey thing going on. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Jaime for commissioning this episode. Jaime, if you're out there, what's up, girl? So it's been a minute. I'm actually going to check and see, because I just want you guys to keep in mind that since the last recording, I have forgotten some things. It's just what's going to happen. So yeah, the last recording was November 6th. And I know what some of you might be thinking. Natasha, you said that there's a 3-month limit on how long there can be between episodes, and then you cancel something. And to that I say, true. However, I'm the boss, and sometimes I can make there be an exception. And when I announced that Ruin and Rising was getting canceled because there hadn't been anything commissioned for it, I had about, I think, like 3 people in the group who all were like, no, but please let us do it. We lost track and haven't been able to, like, either there's always been slots that were taken or it just slipped my mind. So yeah, it's been, let's see, December, January, February, March. It'll be 4 months. Honestly, I've actually basically increased the length of time between to be 3 months, and that way people are able to commission on the day of a recording for the next one if I announce that nothing else has been commissioned yet. But I try and keep it around there. Ruin and Rising, though, I felt about it that it's a simple enough story, really, that it wasn't going to be too taxing for me to try and keep things in mind when I picked it up again. Because that's not something I can do with every series. You know, Travelers, for example, that's a fairly complicated story. And that didn't get commissioned any further, which was a shame because I really liked that show. But I don't think I could come back to Travelers 4 months later and really have a good grip of what's going on. But Ruin and Rising, it's a fairly small cast of characters, a very direct story. And this I felt okay about. And for the most part, coming back into it in these chapters, I didn't feel like I was lost. It was just a couple of times where somebody mentioned a name and I was like, who is that again? So I may have to ask you that in the chat, and I hope that you guys will assist me. And I feel like there was another thing I was going to mention about that, but I think that's about it for right now. So far I have commissioned another, I think, 4 episodes, which I think should take care of the rest of the book, depending. It's hard to tell because the Kindle book is not like regular page numbers. So I estimated with chapters 3 and 4 that was about right based on how long they are in the audiobook. Chapters 1 and 2 plus the prologue were a little bit over an hour. It was like an hour and 20 minutes. And so that's about what chapters 3 and 4 were, and I felt like that was reasonable. But if anybody who has commissioned has a, more accurate measurement that you want me to follow for chapters coming up, let me know. Excuse me. That's another thing. I'm froggy in my throat and I keep sneezing. I'm really just going to have to start taking allergy medications. It's that time. So anyway, I'm going to get started talking about the book now. How exciting. So chapter 3, what we had at the end of chapter 2 was one thing that I definitely did not forget. First, we have got Alina putting her burned handprint on that young man. which sounds like it must be absolute agony, but he's so overcome because she's a saint that to him this is like an incredible blessing and something to be really proud of. This is one of those things that I have very mixed feelings about, not in terms of this book, but just overall the way in which people will interpret pain as a blessing. It's so riddled with problems to interpret things that way, but also when life is full of so much pain, you can also see that as a coping mechanism and understand why people would choose to look at it that way, you know? So I had not forgotten about that. But after that is when she basically grabs up the what's his face? Apparat, and is like, all right, bitch, now it's time for you to do what I say. So chapter 3 starts off with, the doors flew open. I threw out my hands and let light blast into the passageway. A cry went up from the people lining the tunnel. Those who weren't already kneeling fell to their knees, and a chorus of prayer washed over me. Speak, I muttered to the apparat as I bathed the supplicants. This is really hard to say. As I bathed the supplicants in glowing sunlight. And make it good. So, he spins this. Darkness came to this hallowed place. And somebody says, I saw it. I saw the shadows, because they don't realize that came from Alina. So it looks more like, oh, we've been attacked and she defended us, which is pretty fucking good for your brand, honestly. I let the light sweep through the passage, a blinding cascade. Most of these people had never seen what my power could truly do. Someone was weeping, and I heard my name buried in the cries of Sancta, Sancta. We finally had a chance to get free of this place, but what would it mean to leave the White Cathedral behind? I'd be abandoning an army and leaving them in the Apparat's care. And yet there weren't many options open to us. I needed to get above ground. I needed the Firebird. So she tells him that they are going to head out that evening. And you are going to sanction our departure in front of everybody. And he says, it's too soon. The Darkling isn't even in that great a spot. You really shouldn't go out there right now because you're putting yourself at risk when you don't have to. And he tries to tell her the Lantsov boy has few allies. He's talking about the prince, right? When he says the Lantsov boy, this is what I meant when I said I would need help reminding. And let's see. Yeah, okay, I think it is, because she says Nikolai had intended to get his family and Bagra to safety, then return to the fight. I could only hope he'd succeeded, and that the rumors of him wreaking havoc on the northern border were true. Let them weaken each other, see which way the wind blows. I owe Nikolai Lantsov more than that. Is it loyalty that drives you, or greed? The amplifiers have waited countless years to be brought together, and you cannot wait a few more months? Now, look. Maybe the Apparat is right. Maybe she's just after the amplifiers. But I don't like the fact that this man is getting to talk to her about anything. Okay? This man kept her a fucking prisoner. This man manipulated her and everyone around her. This man purposely disabled her. And he's over here getting to argue with her about her movements. I don't think so. No. You know, she says to him in the last chapter, because she tells him no child soldiers. And he starts to say, if somebody's faith motivates them to fight, then who am I to? And she interrupts and says, you're on your knees. This is not a negotiation. End of. I want that energy here. When she says that to him in that chapter, I interpreted it as a sea change You know, I really thought this was going to be a complete shift in the balance of power between the two of them. But then she's over here, like, entertaining his criticisms and shit. What? Why? Bitch, you don't have to listen to this. And I'm not saying that he doesn't necessarily have a point, because we know that the amplifiers are a driving motivation for Alina. Like, there is something to his assertion here. But that's not the point. I don't think he should get to talk to her like this at all. I think that she needs to instill it in him that he is her mouthpiece, and that's it. Because she's letting him get away with too goddamn much, and then he's just going to try this shit again, or something like it. I don't trust him. That's what I'm saying. And the whole let them weaken each other, see which way the wind blows, I really feel like that's a fray sort of vibe, where it's I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and step in with whoever turns out to be winning. And it just reeks of somebody who doesn't understand the morality behind her decisions. He doesn't seem to get or care that she is against the Darkling because he's a bad man who does bad things and is a bad person. And the idea that, like, oh, well, we'll just see who we're up against after the other's taken down. Well, but Nikolai is clearly somebody that you would want on the throne. So why would you step back and just let him be taken out of the equation? That's not good for anybody. But he's just thinking about it in terms of a game, really. Well, there's 3 players. That's too many. Let those 2 knock each other out, and then you step in. That'll make it more organized. And it's like, that's not the point. So yeah, he just doesn't get it. And he says, I am the voice of the people. They did not choose the Lantsov kings or the Darkling. They chose you as their saint, and they will love you as their queen. And she's just like, ugh. And she asks him, do you even think I'm a saint? And he's like, oh my God, you still don't get it. It doesn't matter. That's not it. They've started building altars to you in Fierda where they burn Grisha at the stake. Shit is changing. And she says, I don't want it. And he basically is like, that's too damn bad. Like, just guess what? You don't get a say. You're the figurehead, but you don't have, like, choices in that. They will fight for you because to them, you are salvation. They will starve for you, lay down their lives and their children's lives. They will make war without fear and die rejoicing. There is no greater power than faith, and there will be no greater army than one driven by it. I mean, that's a nice idea. I'm not sure that's true. That's one of those things that I'm like, you can say that from the outside, and some people might tell themselves that, but when it comes down to it, when you're about to die for a cause, all you're thinking about is that you just don't want to die. I would think, you know, unless you're a big symbolic execution of some kind that you can make into a statement. She says the cost is too high because he says this is the way to peace. And he says war is the price of change. And it's ordinary people who pay it. Peasants like me, never men like you. And he starts to respond and she stops him. And I kind of thought, like, to myself, because war is the price of change is honestly true. That's just true. It's an unfortunate thing because this has come up a lot recently with all of the conversations that we've been having in our country about wanting to make major changes and all of these, like, protests that have been happening, fighting for civil rights and human rights. And there have been a lot of folks who hand-wring over the fact that there's violence involved. And they claim that that's not the answer. But violence has literally only ever been the answer. Like, there's been practically nothing that has been accomplished, major changes, without violence being part of what went down. There are a few exceptions, but they're exceptions, not the rule. And what people like to pretend is that if you choose nonviolence, the other side will also choose nonviolence, and that's not how that works. You can choose nonviolence for your side of things, but that does not mean that your people will not die. You know, I mean, Martin Luther King is our favorite example. He preached nonviolence and was fucking assassinated. It's just, so there's this sort of attitude that I find to be kind of elitist, where a lot of, especially white liberals, want to pretend that we can be above it all and restrain ourselves from violence, but still accomplish some kind of change. And I think they really underestimate what those who oppose us would be willing to do to keep things the same. And I think they really underestimate what some people are capable of and the kinds of blood they're willing to have on their hands. So I kind of was on both sides here, where I'm like, the Apparat is right. War is the price of change. That's straight up true. On the other hand, when she's like, oh, and it always happens to be poorer people that pay. Bitch is right too. She's correct. You know, rich people manage to worm their way out of all kinds of consequences. And this is another excellent example. They manage to wind up in a position where they don't have to go to war. Oh, I'm in college, so I'm exempt from the draft because the fact that I can afford school means that I'm too good to die. I'm too valuable to be put on the chopping block. Bitch, why? And that's just a small example. I mean, you guys all know. I'm not telling y'all anything you don't know already. So when she said that, I kind of appreciated it, actually, because what I felt like the author was doing was like, war is the price of change is a really easy thing to say in the abstract. But you shouldn't just be able to be like, that's what it's going to take, and sleep at night with no problem. You have to keep in mind when you say we're going to go to war because it's worth it, that some of the people that you're going to watch die didn't really have a say, weren't necessarily involved, or like had the same kind of faith that you wanted them to have. So, you know, then does that change your idea of what's worth it and what's not? What change is worthy of going to war for and what isn't? It's just an interesting question that you have to think about. It's all well and good to act like you've got a bunch of pieces on a board, but those are human beings who want things, who need things, and don't necessarily have the privilege of choosing whether or not they want to take part in these sorts of things. It can be just as simple as a soldier who's conscripted, or it could be a civilian who's in the wrong place at the wrong time and is just fucking collateral damage, you know? So it's important to keep that in mind, because I know for myself, I used to be somebody who really talked about nonviolence and the concept in general of being more interested in conversation than violence as a means to try and avoid it. It wasn't like I was so foolish as to be like, well, we can just completely sidestep any sort of physical confrontation as long as we just talk to each other. I knew there would be people who wouldn't be interested in that. But I had this sort of, well, as you have to exhaust all of those avenues first. And I have since sort of come to realize, to a degree, that's what the enemy wants from liberals especially, is for us to exhaust ourselves on things that will not work out, but we feel a moral obligation to explore them before we will take things to the next level and maybe go scorched earth. Hint, we'll never go scorched earth because we just don't have it in us, apparently. So I have a lot less interest in that, but I can forget the fact that it's going to be a lot of people who didn't deserve it that are going to wind up hurt when and if we decide to really take things to the next level and begin burning things down, you know? And that's something that I just don't really want to think about. It's unpleasant. It's unfair. It's just another instance of people who deserve better getting screwed, which is what the whole fight is meant to be against. And it feels really counterintuitive to put people in that position yet again, ostensibly, to keep it from happening the next time, which is just, that's never happening. It just feels so hopeless, you know? So anyway, I just like this conversation because I felt like she effectively represented both the Apparat and Alina. I keep wanting to call her Lilia. I don't know where that came from. The Apparat and Alina's arguments, and made me kind of be like, you're both right. This sucks. So I love this conversation. She comes to her room and it's packed with people. And Sergei is like, what the fuck is going on? 1 minute I'm in the infirmary and then I'm in a cell. Calm down, said Tamar. You're not behind bars now. I might as well be. We're all trapped down here, and that bastard is just looking for a chance to get rid of us. If you want out of the caves, then this is your opportunity, I said. We're leaving tonight. And they ask how, and she does the sunlight trick, and everybody's really excited. And at this point, let's see. David is talking about making the blasting powders when he was supposed to be making the salves right underneath everybody's noses, because it's not like the priest guards even know what chemistry looks like. So they couldn't tell he was doing anything other than what he said. And I love Mal. Let's see. I'm trying to find the spot. Here it is. You meant to get caught? Turns out the easiest way to schedule a meeting is to get arrested, said Zoya. Do you know how risky that was? Blame Aratsev, Zoya said with a sniff. It was his idea of a brilliant plan. It did work, Genya observed. Mal lifted a shoulder. Like Sergei said, the Apparat was waiting for an opportunity to take us out of action, and I figured we'd give him one. And let's see, David's frown deepened. It was a controlled blast. The odds that the cave's structure would hold were above average. Ah, above average, said Genya. Why didn't you say so? And Sergei says, you should have told us about the plan. We deserved a warning. You could have at least let me blow something up, added Harshaw. Zoya gave an elaborate shrug. I'm so sorry you felt excluded. Never mind how closely we've been watched and that it was a miracle we weren't found out. We definitely should have jeopardized the whole operation to spare your feelings. Oh, Zoya, you blessed woman. I love you. That was just such a great line. I love that so much. Any chance you're going to tell us where the third amplifier is? Thus far, only the twins, Mal, and I knew where we hoped to find the Firebird. And Nikolai, I reminded myself. Nikolai knew too, if he was still alive. So, basically, they're like, no, we're not going to tell you. You're just going to have to trust us. And I find that interesting. I'm assuming they're worried about people being captured and questioned because the Darkling doesn't know where it is yet. So, or they hope he doesn't. So I'm guessing that's why they're not sharing this information, because the fucking Darkling beat them to the what was the name of the deer? Moritzova's stag, right? So you don't want to risk that shit happening again. So Sturmhond has smuggling lines throughout Ravka. It's possible Nikolai is using them to get arms into the country. If the rumors are true, and he's based somewhere in the north, then there's a good chance the drop point near Rivost is active. That's a lot of maybe, and not much more, Harshaw observed. Mal nodded. True, but it's our best lead. If it's a dead end, we split up. We find a safe house where you can lie low. I take the team to find the Firebird. You're welcome to remain here, I said to the others. I know the pilgrims aren't friendly to Grisha, and after tonight I'm not sure how sentiment will change. But if we're captured above ground... The Darkling doesn't deal kindly with traitors, finished Genya quietly. Everyone shifted uncomfortably, but I made myself meet her gaze. No, he doesn't. So, everybody decides to head out. And, let's see, I'm trying to find the spot. Here it is. Harshaw rose and pushed off from the wall. I'd prefer to stay, he said with a yawn, but Oncat says we go. He hefted the tabby onto his shoulder with one hand. Are you ever going to name that thing? Zoya asked. She has a name. Oncat is not a name. It's just Kalish for cat. Suits her, doesn't it? I want to know about this fucking cat, guys. I don't remember where we met Harshaw. If you guys want to remind me, please do. But Harshaw seems to be able to talk to his cat, and everybody's sort of treating this as a really, what's the word I want? Just sort of an eccentricity of his. And I think that cat can talk. And I don't know if that means like the cat's a person. I don't know if somebody's possessing the cat, the Darkling. I don't think so. I hope not. I don't know. But I feel like there's more to this than meets the eye. And I'm a little bit concerned. Because nobody's really taking it that seriously. And I feel like this deserves to be taken seriously. I'm just saying. And the other thing is, well, it all depends on where we met him. I don't remember, to be honest. So I'll leave it there for right now. I suspected David would have preferred to remain at the White Cathedral, cloistered with Moritzova's journals, but he was our only fabricator, and assuming we found the Firebird, we would need him to forge the second fetter. Nadia seemed happy to go with her brother, though it was Tamar she grinned at on the way out. I'd guessed that Maxime would choose to remain here at the infirmary, and I'd been right. Maybe I could get Vladim and the other priest guards to set an example for the pilgrims and take advantage of Maxime's skills as a healer. The only surprise was Sergei. Though the White Cathedral was miserable, damp, and dull, it was also relatively secure. As eager as Sergei had seemed to escape the Apparat's grasp, I hadn't been sure he'd wanted to take his chances with us above ground, but he'd nodded tersely and simply stated, I'll be there. Maybe we were all desperate for blue sky and a chance to feel free again, no matter the risk. And at this point, they all head out, and Mal sighs and says, well, it was worth a try. And she realizes he was hoping some of them would stay behind. And he's just of the opinion 12 people is too many. He says, a group that big will slow us through the tunnels, and once we're above ground, they'll put us at greater risk. As soon as we have a chance, we'll need to split up. There's no way I'm taking a dozen Grisha into the southern mountains. And I have this, like, sort of, I see what he's saying for sure, and I don't think he's wrong, but I wonder if they aren't going to be glad that they have that kind of number later. I mean, first of all, just on a practical level as an author, you need some red shirts, right? You just got to have some people that you can kill along the way without getting rid of your main characters. And then on the other side of that is this allows you room to have like bigger, more elaborate battles because you've got more people and they're all Grisha practically. So I'm wondering, so this is another thing that comes up a little bit later. She asks him how the, I think she's asking how he's tracking Nikolai. I think she's asking about Nikolai, and he says that he put like a beetle in. I wish I should. You know what? I'm going to wait and talk about this until I. Oh, here it is. You think I can track a giant mythic bird, but I can't locate one loud-mouthed prince? A prince who managed to evade the Darkling for months. Mal studied me. Alina, do you know how I made that shot back in the kettle? I had David put a beetle in the pouch. Why? To make aiming easier. All I had to do was track it. My brows rose. Now that's an impressive trick. He shrugged. It's the only one I know. If Nikolai's alive, we'll find him. And I gotta ask you guys, like, this is a superpower, right? And it's been sort of hinted at before that Mal as a tracker is absolutely beyond anything that any other person's capable of. But this feels like we're going beyond what a person can do. And we're getting into some sort of weird sixth sense sort of thing. And I'm really curious if this is going to turn out to mean more, or this would be kind of messed up, but it would also, like, in a way kind of make sense. What if they reach the Firebird and she gets her final fetter, and then Mal's tracking sort of leaves him, and it turns out that fate wanted him to help Alina, and once he did that, his like amazing ability totally departs because it wasn't actually his. It was something that like a greater force had bestowed upon him. I don't really want that to happen, but you know, it's sort of the whole thing with him being able to track a beetle just because it's like in a bag. That's not a normal thing that a tracker, like that's another, something else is going on. That's no longer tracking. That's something else. So I'm just very curious what that's going to be. Let's see. Me and Mal, I suppose we made a kind of peace, but it wasn't an easy one. I wanted to tell him he hadn't failed me, but that wasn't quite true. I'd lied to him about the visions that plagued me. He'd pushed me away when I'd needed him most. Maybe we'd both asked each other to give up too much. Fair or not, I felt like Mal had turned his back on me, and some part of me resented him for it. And I mean, honestly, the whole thing with like her seeing those visions and not saying anything to anybody was really frustrating, because if it hadn't been that she was having visions of the Darkling, I think, like, I already was feeling like, oh my God, you gotta tell him, come on. But I do understand that, you know, there's a rivalry between the two of them. And so maybe he's like the exact not person that you should tell about the fact that you're seeing visions of your ex-boyfriend floating around. I don't know. It just, to me, it was... This is always an issue for me in stories, is characters choosing not to communicate with each other for reasons that aren't that clear. There are times when it makes sense somebody doesn't want to tell somebody else a thing, and you just need to account for that in your story. But then there are times where they don't share, and it feels like the reasoning is so vague because the author couldn't come up with a good reason either, and still have that character be a rational, reasonable person. So they just sort of don't explain it. Her not telling him, I really just, as much as I get that it's the Darkling and she doesn't want him to know about the connection the two of them have, I want her to set aside her relationship bullshit to prioritize what's going on with her fucking country and her weird superpower. You know, it just feels like the responsible thing to do. And the fact that she isn't willing to do that up until almost the end there, it's just tiresome. Girl, who cares if Mal is going to be weird about it? Just tell him what the fuck is going on so that he knows, because otherwise you just, first of all, you look like a lunatic and it turns out you weren't. You thought you might be, but like you're making it look like that for sure. And secondly, you are, like the scenes in which that happened, it was always like Mal thinking that she was rejecting him somehow. So her being like, oh, he turned his back on me when I needed him the most. I'm like, well, you didn't share that you needed him. It's a two-way street. He can't read minds and you weren't being forthcoming with him. So what are you thinking, girl? Come on. So she lays back and because he has taken off and she's in her room by herself and decides to reach out to the Darkling and sort of tells herself this isn't going to work, but I'm going to try it and then maybe I'll have a nap. It doesn't work. Nothing happens. And she starts thinking about the Apparat and that she had thought about killing him and was deadly serious about it. And that she burned somebody's flesh on purpose. And that basically these are all decisions that the Alina of a year or two ago would never have made. That something is genuinely changing over in her. The girl I'd been never would have considered such things. I hated the Darkling for what he'd done to Bagra and Genya, but was I so different? Of course you're different. Are you high? He mutilated Bagra and Genya to make a point. Just to instill fear in everyone around them and leave them helpless on purpose, blinding them. You know, like, this was an act of humiliation. There was more to it than just the fact that he, like, did something to them. It was the intent behind it. It was the message meant to be sent with it. It was everything all together. You burned a dude on his chest who was elated to let you do it. He was all about it and sees it as an honor. One could say you had consent almost. Like, she didn't say, I'm going to burn you. That cool? But I think we all know if she said, I'm going to burn you, you cool with that? The dude would have been like, oh my God, yes, please. We know that from the way he reacted to getting this favor bestowed upon him. And you didn't blind him when you did it. You just left a mark on his chest. So yeah, he's been, quote, mutilated, as you say. I think that's a bit far. I don't feel like I'd use that term for it. And he has the full functionality of his eyes and mouth and limbs. It's not the same, and you comparing yourself to the Darkling is just self-indulgent nonsense, and get over it. Honestly, stop it. But she's thinking, when the third amplifier was around my wrist, would I be different from him at all? Maybe not, I conceded. And with that admission came the barest tremor, a vibration moving over the connection between us, an answering echo at the other end of an invisible tether. So that's my problem with this scene, is that she's comparing herself to the Darkling in a way that for me doesn't ring true at all. And it's obviously to set up the connection between the two of them. She is meant to think how similar they are so that he gets sort of summoned on his end. But it feels too transparent. That's what the author's doing. She wants her to think a thing, so she has her think it, even though it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't work. And it just isn't rational in any way, in my opinion. And I mean, the closest thing I can say to, I guess that makes sense, is that Alina hasn't been super rational throughout this series. She's really made some stupid decisions, really ridiculous assumptions, has been incredibly blind about things that I was like, this is so obvious. What are you doing? So I guess maybe one could say this is still in character. But I don't know. This felt like a really contrived way to get the connection between the two of them going, and I personally didn't buy it. I felt myself drawn upward out of myself, speeding toward him. Maybe this was what Mal felt when he tracked. The distant pull of the other, a presence that demanded attention even if it couldn't be seen or touched. One moment I was floating in the darkness of my closed eyes, and the next I was standing in a brightly lit room. Everything around me was blurry, but I recognized this place just the same. I was in the throne room at the Grand Palace. People were talking. It was as if they were underwater. I heard noise, but no words. I knew the moment the Darkling saw me. He came into sharp focus, though the room around him remained in a murky blur. His self-control was so great that no one near him would have noticed the fleeting look of shock that passed over his perfect features. But I saw his gray eyes widen, his chest lock as his breath caught. His fingers clenched the arms of his chair. No, his throne. Then he relaxed, nodding along to whatever the person before him was saying. I actually really enjoy the description of what it's like to be near him and how he's in focus, but everybody around him, it's just sort of like weird underwater sounds. I 100% can picture this in my head. I'm certain that an effect like this was in a movie or something, and so I'm just sort of filling in those blanks. And he eventually gets himself out of this conversation and into a private area so that he can talk to her. And he says something about how apt a pupil she is. And she's really mad at herself because the fact that he gives her kind of a compliment here makes her happy. And she hates the fact that she's like responding favorably to his compliments. She's like, oh my God, I still give a shit what this motherfucker thinks of me? When am I going to get over that? This sucks. And that is relatable, ladies and gentlemen. Oh my God, I feel like we've all been there. Somebody that we like otherwise despise, and yet for some reason their opinion means something to us, and we just don't know why that's true. It shouldn't. But here we are, you know, I really get that. And he basically does the thing where he's like, you could come and be my queen anytime you want. And she's like, dude, come on. I know how that's going to go. You're going to act like we're equals. And then a day will come, shortly, I have no doubt, in which I won't agree with the decision you make. You'll tell me to do something and I won't do it. And all of a sudden, you're going to fucking do whatever the fuck to me. Because we're not really equals. That was just the sales pitch you gave me to get me on the throne so that you could be cemented. And I'm not fucking interested. You're just trying to play me like you play everybody. I'm not an idiot. I know what's going on. And I was like, good for you. Do you think there would be that it would be any different with your tracker beside you, with that Lansov pup? Yes, I said simply. Because you would be the stronger one? Because they're better men than you. I really liked this answer. And I love his response, which is, you might make me a better man. She says, and you might make me a monster. Now, here's the thing. I really enjoy, you might make me a better man, because that is such a fucking thing that men do, is expect women to make them better. They're not really interested in making the effort on their own. They sort of think that women are just like slightly more virtuous than men as a whole, even though they wouldn't ever like say that. But that's really at the root of it. And they believe, I think, that if they just are around somebody who's decent, that they'll absorb it through osmosis and they won't actually have to put forth a daily effort to be better. And that what happens is that when the osmosis doesn't seem to be occurring, they then blame the woman for not achieving their, like, betterment for them, or they act as if the woman is impatient with them, because eventually women do get fed up and are like, you keep acting like you want to be better, but you're not just being better. What the fuck? And so it turns into this, like, victim blamey thing. And just the fact that he would say, you could make me a better man, is just, that's exactly what a motherfucker like him would say. And when she says, you might make me a monster, I mean, maybe, but also he might make you a victim. And you've been that before. We don't want to do that again. That's something that I really wish would come after the sentence, don't you want to make him better? Well, what will he make me? That's a valid fucking question. Because I don't think I have seen a single instance of a woman making a fuckboy into a decent man. It's never happened. They have to want to and do it themselves. That's all, the only way it fucking works. And there are so many women out there who really seem to think if a man isn't on their side, it's because they weren't a good enough woman to motivate him. Instead of it being, well, maybe he's the worst and sucks. It's, why can't I inspire him enough? Because that's not your fucking job. It's just not. You know, like, just, ugh. So, let's see, here it is. She says, you are stronger, wiser, infinite in experience, but I am an apt pupil. His eyes flew open. I caught the briefest glimpse of rage in his gray gaze before I severed the connection. So then she wakes up and she's sitting there like, oh God, should I even have done it? Like, I didn't learn anything. I saw that he's doing great. Oh, good. That's really what I fucking needed to know. And that he's at the Grand Palace. Well, I probably could have found that out by asking somebody on the street. But then she's like, I really wanted him to know I could do this shit, though. Now I knew what he saw when he visited me, what information he could or couldn't cull from the contact. Now I had practice in one more power that had only belonged to him, and I'd enjoyed it. At the little palace, I dreaded those visions, thought I might be losing my mind, and worse, I'd wondered what they said about me. No longer. I was done being ashamed. Let him feel what it was to be haunted. And, you know, she's thinking about the variety of things that he suggested, that he was getting the amplifiers for her, and she's like, yeah, no. They were technically for me, because it was like, you know, he was putting rims on his vehicle. You know, he was thinking he was going to be in charge of her, and so it was ostensibly something she would use, but it was because he was using her. The services were quite a spectacle. We move on here. It was still a challenge to summon so far underground, but I threw blazing light over the walls of the White Cathedral, drawing on every reserve to awe the crowd that moaned and swayed below. And she's watching the Apparat and is just like trying to decide whether leaving him by himself is going to be a bad idea. Personally, I think so. I don't know exactly what he could get up to, but I feel like it's just not a good call. But what can you do? And she tells all of them, you are my eyes. You are my fists. You are my swords. The crowd cheered. As one, they chorused back to me, Sancta Alina. Not bad, Mal said. I've been listening to the Apparat go on for nearly 3 months. Something had to rub off. Keep them strong in their faith, I told Ruby and the other soldiers. I hoped that 3 days would give us plenty of time to get well away from the White Cathedral. But knowing the Apparat, he'd probably talk his way out before dinner. I knew you, Ruby said, clutching my fingers. I was in your regiment, do you remember? Of course I do, I said kindly. We hadn't been friends. Back then, Ruby had been more interested in Mal than religion. I'd been nearly invisible to her. Now she released a sob and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. "Sancta," she whispered fervently. Whenever I thought my life couldn't get any stranger, it did. I really liked this moment. You know, it's one thing to know that all these strangers think that you're a saint, but it's way different when somebody that you used to know who just paid no attention to you is suddenly all up in your shit. And this is, you know, the joke about what happens when you like get famous, like, you know, for anything as a singer is usually the biggest like comparison, because singers tend to have posses that go around with them, and people are trying to get in on that somehow or get a leg up in an industry because you have contacts. And all of a sudden, somebody who just had no fucking time for you wants to be your best friend. And it's like, yeah, but I know fucking why. Thank you. So you know what I'm going after, priest, and you know the power I'll wield when I return. Nothing happens to the Soldat Soul or to Maxim. We are not enemies, Sancta Alina, the Apparat said gently. You must know that all I've ever wanted was to see you on Ravka's throne. I almost smiled at that. I know, priest. On the throne and under your thumb. You are not what I expected, he admitted. Not quite the saint you bargained for? A lesser saint, he said, but perhaps a better queen. I will pray for you, Alina Starkov. I liked that. A lesser saint, but perhaps a better queen. I have to think that a saint would not make a particularly good ruler. You know? Like, that's not really... You need to be shrewd, and saints aren't known for that. I don't know. So, then we have the party heading out, and there's somebody who gives a shawl over, like, puts them over Genya's shoulders. Dark green, not black, she said. For you, not black. An ache began in my throat. It wasn't just the Apparat who'd kept me isolated from these people. I'd distanced myself from them as well. I distrusted their faith, but mostly I feared their hope. The love and care in these tiny gestures was a burden I didn't want. That makes sense to me. You know, I've given Alina a lot of shit for being like, oh, I don't want to be a saint. And I'm like, oh my God, shut up, who cares? But in small moments like that, I do sort of get it. It can be a weird thing to feel like people are looking to you when you didn't ask to be the person they look to. You know, it's just an odd position. And that's in like a very ordinary situation, never mind something of this scale. Through David's access to the archives and Mal's innate sense of direction, they'd managed to construct a rough map of the tunnel network. After my escape from Os Alta, the Darkling's men had tried to penetrate the network of tunnels beneath Ravka's churches and holy sites. When their searches turned up empty, they'd begun bombing, closing off exit routes, trying to drive anyone seeking shelter to the surface. The Darkling's alchemy had created new explosives that collapsed buildings and forced combustible gases below ground. All it took was a single inferni spark, and the whole section of ancient network of tunnels collapsed. It was one of the reasons the Apparat had insisted I remain at the White Cathedral. So, at the end of this chapter, it seems like they've been hit by a bomb. And I'm sort of interested to see if that is indeed what it is, if it's just what it seems like it is, or if it turns out to be a red herring and there's something else going on. It was a relief to be moving through the tunnels, finally doing something after so many weeks of confinement. My body was still weak, but I felt stronger than I had in months, and I pushed onward without complaint. I tried not to think too hard about what it would mean if the smuggling station at Rivost wasn't active. How were we supposed to find a prince who didn't want to be found and do it while remaining hidden ourselves? If Nikolai was alive, he might be looking for me, or he might have sought alliance elsewhere. For all he knew, I'd died in the battle at the little palace. So as they're heading out, she's beginning to realize that Mal was right. There are too many of them. They are noisy. They're going too slowly. they're sort of an unwieldy number that makes it hard to like keep track if everybody's staying together. Let's see, but I'm trying to find the spot where she says, Zoya, Nadia, and Adrik were spread out along the line. In case of a cave-in, the air our squallors could summon might provide valuable breathing time for anyone trapped. I liked that detail. I thought that was interesting. And that also means that like having more people will be harder because more people is more oxygen, you know? So let's see. She's talking to David about how he packed all of the fucking journals. And she makes a joke about how they might be good kindling. And he's like, oh my God, tell me you're joking. And she's like, kind of. She says, I'd hoped the journals would give me insight into the Firebird and maybe even into how the amplifiers could help me destroy the Fold. But they'd been a dead end. And if I was honest, they'd frightened me a little too. Bagra had warned me of Moritzova's madness, and yet somehow I'd expected to find wisdom in his work. Instead, his journals had provided me with a study in obsession, all of it documented in nearly indecipherable scrawl. Apparently, genius didn't require good penmanship. His early journals chronicled his experiments, the blacked-out formula for liquid fire, a means of preventing organic decay, the trials that had led to the creation of Grisha steel, a method for restoring oxygen to the blood, the endless year he'd spent finding ways to create unbreakable glass. His skills extended beyond those of an ordinary fabricator, and he was well aware of it. One of the essential tenets of Grisha theory was like calls to like. But Moritzova seemed to believe that if the world could be broken down to the same small parts, each Grisha would be able to manipulate them. Are we not all things? He demanded, underlining the words for emphasis. He was arrogant, audacious, but still sane. Then his work on the amplifiers had begun, and even I could see the change. The text got denser, messier. The margins were full of diagrams and crazed arrows that referred back to earlier passages. Worse were the descriptions of experiments he'd performed on animals, the illustrations of his dissections. They turned my stomach and made me think Moritzova had deserved whatever early martyrdom he'd received. He'd killed animals and then brought them back to life, sometimes repeatedly, delving deeper into Merzost creation, the power of life over death, trying to find a way to create amplifiers that might be used together. It was forbidden power, but I knew its temptation, and I shuddered to think that pursuing it might have driven him mad. If he was led by some noble purpose, I didn't see it in his pages, but I sensed something more in his fevered writings, in his insistence that power was everywhere for the taking. He had lived long before the creation of the Second Army. He was the most powerful Grisha the world had ever known, and that power had isolated him. I remembered the Darkling's words to me. There are no others like us, Alina, and there never will be. Maybe Moritzova wanted to believe that if there were no others like him, there could be, that he might create Grisha of greater power. Or maybe I was just imagining things, seeing my own loneliness and greed in Moritzova's pages. The mess of what I knew and what I wanted, my desire for the Firebird, my own sense of difference, had all gotten too hard to untangle. So I actually really liked this, getting a little bit more insight into Moritzova, who has felt sort of like enigmatic and distant. And also her realizing that like she's assigning some motivations to him that might not actually be his, and just what it is that he seemed to be after. I just found this really interesting. So we are moving through all of these different caves for the next several days. And a lot of this isn't actually important so much as it is just interesting. They have to like ford a river at one point. They are going through like caves that are studded with stones, and Mal is sort of going back and talking to people who are at the back of the line because they're lagging, and he starts a conversation with them and then begins to pick his pace up so that they follow because they're trying to keep up while he's chatting, and gets them back on course with everybody else. But yeah, there's all these different things that they are, let's see. Oh yeah, here's the thing with Harshaw. Let's see, Harshaw didn't just annoy me, he made me nervous. He liked to drag his flint along the cave walls, sending off little sparks, and he was constantly slipping bits of hard cheese out of his pocket to feed Oncat, then chuckling as if the tabby had said something particularly funny. One morning we woke to find that he'd shaved the sides of his scalp so that his crimson hair ran in a single thick stripe down the center of his head. "What did you do?" shrieked Zoya. "You look like a deranged rooster." Harshaw just shrugged. Oncat insisted. I am very curious about this dude. What? We stumbled into a series of little caves glittering with what may well have been real rubies. Genya dubbed it the jewel box, and after that we took to naming them all to pass the time. There was the orchard, a cavern of stalactites and stalagmites that had fused together into slender columns. Less than a day later, we came across the dance hall, a long cave of pink quartz with a floor so slippery we had to crawl over it, occasionally sliding to our bellies. Then there was the eerie, partially submerged iron portcullis we called the Angel Gate. It was flanked by 2 winged stone figures, their heads bent, their hands resting on marble broadswords. The winch worked, and we passed through it without incident, but why had it been put there? And by whom? So then they wind up someplace with a lake, and Mal puts his hand in and gets bitten by something, and it doesn't seem to be a big deal, but she does laugh at him for just sticking his hand into a strange body of water, and I'm 100% Team Alina on this one. And they have a bit of a conversation here, and he basically tells her that he's still in love with her a little bit, but he can't focus on that right now. He's going to admit that that's how he feels, but also he has a job to do to keep her safe and get her the fuck out of this. You were meant for more than me, and I'll die fighting to give it to you, but please don't ask me to pretend it's easy. All right, I guess. That's fair. So this is when Harshaw says, Oncat scratches me all the time. Funny thing is, she likes to stay close. And she's like, are you trying, is this a metaphor? What are you saying? Are you being profound, Harshaw? Actually, I was wondering if I ate enough of those fish, would I start to glow? I shook my head. Of course, one of the last living Inferni would have to be insane. I fell in step with the others and headed into the next tunnel. Come on, Harshaw, I called over my shoulder. Then the first explosion hit. So that is the end of chapter 4. Ooh, and I'm like just a little over, so that works out well. Yay! Could barely see me. Sorry for those of you who are in the chat. The sun went down and I vanished. So yeah, I am glad to be back on this, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to finish this book. And thank you again to Jaime for commissioning it. I appreciate you. Let's see when the next episode is. Tuesday, March 30th. So next week. All right. I will see you then, guys. And until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.